Diana, good afternoon. You're a little bit late, but not so much.
Because of Palikimas.
I'm Egidijus Aleksandravicius from the Institute of Lithuanian Immigration, and my duty today is to introduce our guest, Mr. Žantovský, and moderate our discussion. Coming here and thinking about the intellectual biography of our guest, about the books on Woody Allen or on Vaclavo Havelo, I started thinking, is it that we are living in the time with some troubles in having heroes, we believe? When the peak of that climate of the fake news, when the modes and some propaganda efforts to fight the information wars, denying some rights for being heroes for different people and different nations. Say this damn Trump era of Western world, speaking about everything. And then we return back to the places, to the symbolic individuals, like Valdo Adamkaus, Presidential Library, President Valdo Adamkaus, President Vaclavo Havelo. And two places, two political leaders, and some sort of hope and chance that we can have our heroes. It depends on our memories, on our knowledge, on our values, on our beliefs, whatever. And that's why your visit here allows us to have a lecture on that. Your last book on Vaclav Havel, your understanding of the role of the previous president of the Czech Republic, and the mission of Vaclav Havel Presidential Library. Everything is in your hands. You are now the master.
Thank you very much. I will probably do this standing because we just had a lunch and I had the opportunity to taste your zeppelinas for the first time, and
And you will need water.
I'm afraid what would happen if I stay seated. So it's thank you, Professor, for the introduction, and thank you, the Valdo Adamkaus Library, for their very kind invitation. It's great to be in Lithuania, and it's great to be in Kaunas. I've been only here for 2 hours, and I already feel Kaunastic, and it's great to be in the house that preserves the legacy of one of the great leaders of the newly free part of Europe of the last 28 years, and to speak to my colleagues about the affinities and the similarities in our recent history, our recent problems, and our hopes for the future. Now, I will start by saying a few things about the place I'm coming from. It's the Václav Havel Library in Prague, like the Adamkaus Museum and Library. It's an institution, an NGO that preserves, collects, researches, publicizes, promotes and defends the legacy of the last president of Czechoslovakia and the first president of the Czech Republic, of human rights activist and defender, of a prisoner of conscience, and also a great writer, playwright and essayist, Vaclav Havel. So in this sense, in this purpose, it's quite similar to what we have seen here. In other ways, it's quite different. First, it's a library but not a museum. When it was started, Václav Havel was still alive, and he left us some notes about what he saw the institution as doing, and he made it very clear he was not interested in the museum part, that he was interested in a space for people to come together, meet, discuss and debate, not just questions doing with his life and work, but also with some of our current problems and issues, and what it had to do with the history of the struggle for human rights and democracy in Czechoslovakia and in other countries for the region. So we mostly about documents. We are, as any library, an archive, a big archive with more than 50,000 items, and some of the items are archives in their own right. But because we do not have the luck of being installed in such a great building as this, we have a much smaller building. Most of our archives, more than 90%, are digital. Which has the advantage, on the other hand, of them being accessible online by anyone who registers on our website and can access the documents without having to come to Prague and to the library. We are a small publishing institution, a small publisher. We publish about 15-20 books a year. About Havel, on Havel, by Havel, the times, the friends, the family, and so on and so forth. We are disseminating the information that we able to discover and research through all the modern means that exists through our website, Facebook, Flickr, Twitter, Instagram, and I'm losing count of the names and the gadgets, but you get the idea. But last but not least, we are what would be called a public advocacy. Doing the debating and discussing that Havel wished us to do, and to do that we have a meeting, a debate, a discussion every night of the week in the library, sometimes 2 discussions a day about mostly current problems like problems of the European integration, migration crisis, minority issues, human rights in the Czech Republic, outside, in Crimea, in Ukraine, in Myanmar, or other Turkey, other countries of the world. A lot of our programming is also about literature and writing, especially political writing. On the contemporary issues and so on. And because we have a full house practically every night, so we stream some of our programs online, and we later also make them accessible through our YouTube channel. And we also hold a couple of major conferences every year, one in the spring which we call the Václav Havel European Dialogues, that discusses the contemporary problems of Europe. And we have offshoots of that in Brussels and in Dublin and in Paris, smaller Václav Havel European Dialogues. And then we have an annual autumn conference on the occasion of the Václav Havel Human Prize Award that we present each year together with the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and the Charter 77 Foundation to a prominent human rights activist in Europe. The prize went to this year to a Turkish human rights activist, a judge who unfortunately could not attend because he's in prison, and last year it went to an amazing Yazidi young woman, Nadia Murad, who was one of the people who were kidnapped and tortured and raped by the Islamic State people, and who managed to escape. And since then she devotes her time to campaigning for the rights and the freedom of the Yazidi people in northern Iraq, etc., etc. So this is what we do. But now, why we do it? We do it because there are so many people coming, especially young people. Most of our audiences are young people between 20 and 30 years of age, and they coming to us. Not all of them know a whole lot about Václav Havel, but some of them do, and they all coming looking for something. And what they are looking for, it seems to us, is a different kind of thinking about the world, a different kind of thinking about politics, a different kind of a politician, and they seem to believe that Václav Havel was such a kind of politician, and we believe in the library. I have a wonderful team of mostly younger people who are very professional, but at the same time very enthusiastic, and who shared the belief that Václav Havel was someone who did not engage in politics to win power or to win influence or to make a fortune or to be important, but he went into politics to make sense of his own life. And that's what he believed was the true meaning of politics, because he formed his views about politics in the communist era, and in his most famous essay, The Power of the Powerless, he describes how being alienated from your own beliefs, from your own identity, being forced to express views that are not yours, that are imposed on you from the outside, sometimes by force, sometimes by psychological pressure, makes it impossible for you to lead a meaningful life, and that the only way to lead a meaningful life is to live in harmony with your own identity, with your own beliefs, to live in truth, as he and his colleagues put it at the time. And that also requires a sense of responsibility for not only your own life, but also for the lives of people around you and for the lives of people in other parts of the world, maybe people who are even less fortunate than you are and who have to struggle with more serious problems than we do. And he came to the conclusion that this is a kind of politics that is open to everybody, that does not require one to run for the parliament or to have an office or to be a member of a political party, but that is the politics in the broadest sense of the world, and that if people come together in the form of various associations, groups, professing the same values and the same goals, they can become incredibly powerful just because they deny the powers that be the automatic allegiance, the lip service that he illustrated on the example of the grocer in the Power of the Powerless essay of the grocer who puts during the communist days, who puts in the window of his shop the slogan "Proletarians of all countries unite," without believing that proletarians should unite and of all countries, and without even giving it a thought, but just to be let alone by the government, and Havel came to the conclusion that if he denied the government that pleasure, if he just refrained from putting the slogan into the shop window of his store, something that took some courage for those of us who remember the communist eras, but it did not take heroism. I mean, it was not like risking your life. Then he would be free of the control and the powers that be would no longer exercise this total influence over him they had in the totalitarian regime. So this is as close as I can explain the legacy that Václav Havel left us, and it is in our minds much more important than what he did as the president of the country, all the state visits he took, all the visitors he welcomed, although they were also very important. Some of them were very important milestones in the history of the country, and by the way, President Adamkaus' visit in Prague in 1999 is well remembered still for the obvious reasons. It was the first visit of a Lithuanian president to Prague. Of course, Mr. Landsbergis came to Prague already in I believe 1990, but that was he was the speaker of the parliament at the time. But we also remember the Adamkaus visit because it came through no fault of his own. Only on the second attempt, he was originally scheduled to come in May but Václav Havel fell ill and had to write him a letter apologizing and invited him again for I think September, and in September 1999 he finally came. So, you know, all these things are important. It is, of course, very important that Václav Havel, together with other Central European leaders, with Lech Walesa and others, was spearheading the drive that we spoke of at the time as the return to Europe drive, that he was promoting the idea of European integration and also of the transatlantic security cooperation and the enlargement of the North Atlantic Alliance. And I think it's fair to note here that after the Czech Republic, Poland and Hungary were accepted into NATO in 1999, Havel was very consistent in campaigning for the second round of the enlargement of NATO in 2002, which included Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia and Slovakia and Romania and Bulgaria, and that he never lost any opportunity when meeting with American presidents and other Western leaders to remind them that the reintegration or liberation of Central and Eastern Europe would not be finished until every country that had an opportunity and that had the will and the wish to join the Atlantic integration and the European integration should be allowed to join. This was also the topic of his speech at the Vilnius University during his visit here in 1996. And and in the United States and other countries, he's largely remembered for all these steps he orchestrated and helped make happen during his presidency. But for us in the library and for many people back home, his importance goes beyond that and is relevant to some of our problems of today, even 70 years or 8 years after his death. And I will now dwell on some of these ideas and on why I think and believe they are relevant. In thinking about Havel's legacy today, it is difficult to ignore the contrast between the era of hope he brought to the world stage almost 30 years ago and our current, somewhat diminished state of soul-searching, crisis of trust, and lack of perspective in the European project. And if you look at what's been happening over the last few months with the elections in Germany, in other countries, including elections back home in the Czech Republic, you can see that the crisis is still going on. There are people who believe that after the election of Macron in France, after the victory of the mainstream parties in the Dutch election, after the election of the Austrian president last year, the West is over and the crisis is behind us. But if you look at the electoral numbers, at the statistics, you will see that in each successive election, the number of votes for what some people call the populist parties and what I prefer to call the anti-system parties, because I don't know anymore what populism means, is regularly growing. It's still growing. It grew in Germany, it grew in the Czech Republic, it grew in Holland in every election. And what makes it even more troubling is that to prevent these guys from winning, some of the mainstream parties are increasingly adopting the rhetorics of the more extreme parties, which moves the whole political system off the center. And there may be some academic argument whether it is to the right of the center or left of the center, but that's not that important. It is of the center. There's no immediate light at the end of the tunnel, and at times like this it is good to remember Havel's maxim that hope is not a certainty that something will turn out well, but a belief that something has a meaning, regardless of how it turns out. Havel was an early, almost prophetic believer in the European integration. When I was researching his biography, I came at an amazing quote in a letter he wrote to a friend when he was 16 on the 2nd March 1953. And he writes, quote, "Look, the united Europe is already being born," unquote. Well, the date is important here. Few people at the time attached that much significance to the signing of treaties on the European Coal Community on February 10 and European Steel Community on the 1st of March 1953, especially people who lived behind the Iron Curtain. How did he get the idea that this was a momentous new start? I don't know, but he did. And during his presidency, he was a tireless promoter of the European integration and of the accession of the Czech Republic and other countries of post-community Europe into the EU. However, he was far from an uncritical admirer. In his first speech to the European Parliament on the 8th of March 1994, fully aware of how long the road was that his own country still had to travel, what obstacles it had to overcome, and how much it would depend on the goodwill of the EU institutions, including the European Parliament itself, he did not stop at expressing his genuinely felt admiration for the European project, but went on to offer critical reflections, which in retrospect could be seen as rather far-sighted. After praising the EU as, quote, "an admirable work of the human spirit and its rational skill," unquote, and extolling its achievement in building the system of pan-European institutions, a single market, and the beginnings of a common currency, which we have to congratulate this country, you already have, we don't, he went on to say, quote, "This admiration, almost exaltation, has however been mixed with a feeling which is less encouraging. What has been addressed was my reason rather than my heart," unquote. What was missing in the European project in Havel's view was, and again quote, "a spiritual, moral, or emotional dimension. Although the EU is based on a grand complex of civilization values, perhaps the most important task that the EU is facing today is a new and really clear consideration of what could be called European identity, a new and really clear articulation of the European responsibility, and enhanced interest in the very meaning of the European integration, and its broader context in the contemporary world, and a new creation of its ethos, or if you wish, charisma." Well, such identity in Europe or of Europe is today increasingly in doubt. And Václav Havel argued repeatedly in a number of essays and speeches that for a clear European identity to emerge, it was also necessary to know where Europe begins and where it ends, physically as well as spiritually. And this has been made even less clear by recent events. Ever since the drafters of the European Constitution, which was never adopted, you remember, have been unable to agree on the simple fact that the Europe of today has been built on the foundations of the antiquity, Judaism and Christianity, our identity is seemingly a free-for-all. But any free-for-all will not produce an identity, only its absence. It is a sobering thought, and I don't want to cause offense to anyone, but it is a sobering thought that perhaps the single most visible expression of European continental identity today is the Eurovision Song Contest, which is itself a cheap imitation of the cheapest American pop music. You know, not much of an identity there. The concept of human rights, something that Václav Havel felt so strongly about and sacrificed so much for, has become somewhat elusive as well. It has been expanded beyond the basic human rights and freedoms and diluted to the point where it only makes sense to lawyers who hang their shingles on its shop. My favorite of these there are many of these newfangled rights, like, you know, the right to a broadband internet, the right to a guaranteed income. But my favorite is the right to be forgotten. It's the entitlement adopted by the European Parliament to have controversial facts about one's life or career removed from the internet, and which is, in my mind, a perfectly Orwellian concept. And if you read some of the literature behind it, some of the justification of this, it is, according to the literature, it is designed to prevent the media and other sources to stigmatize people for what they have done in the past. And I claim that our hard-won experience during the totalitarian era has taught us exactly the opposite. We have a duty to remember, not a right to forget or to be forgotten. And again, the collective memory, a clear record, no matter how inconvenient to individuals or groups, is an essential part of that elusive identity we are seeking, and of the concept of truth as well. Because, you know, people who forget about their past, as Unamuno said, are condemned to repeat it. And we certainly don't want to, or most of us don't want to repeat what we had been through. Now, the next thing beyond the human rights is the concept of truth itself. And it was central to Havel's thinking in the expression of the living in truth idea, and but not just in the expression of ideas, but in its in testifying to it in his life and in his activity. I mean, Havel went to prison for 5 years for what he believed in. He had an offer from the secret police to go abroad and go to the United States, to New York, and be an admired and respected playwright and intellectual there, and he turned it down because he believed that it would not be in keeping with what he sought as living in truth. But the truth is that this concept recently has fared quite badly. And in my thinking, its erosion dates back to the political upheavals of 1968 and the postmodernist wave of deconstruction of truth into narratives of competing truths, and finally into a universe of disconnected tweets and posts which no longer aspire to being the truth and remain content with denying that anything like the truth exists. This is the post-truth society that is so widely bandied about these days. But it is not the truth that has become extinct. It is rather the need to look for it. Havel's dictum of living in truth should never be confused with the arrogant certainty of owning the truth. Of course, we know that there are different perspectives of truth and that to arrive at something that is established or true demands a lot of work, and it's often very painful because sometimes the truth itself is painful. So it is not the truth as a revealed fact that Havel was thinking about. It is the understanding of the truth as a process, as a journey through which one realizes one's own identity and finds meaning in one's own life. Havel was a truth seeker, not a truth dispenser. And for too many people today, this quest has become too demanding, too challenging, or simply useless. And that is associated with the next concept in Havel's thinking, and that is the concept of humility. Ever since his most famous essay, The Power of the Powerless, he had been critical of what he saw as the hubris of modern technological society and its obsession with progress. Whereas Karl Marx wrote that philosophers only explain the world while it was necessary to change it, Havel insisted that first it was necessary to understand the world, not only change it. In his speech to the Italian Senate in April 2002, in the last year of his presidency, Havel pointed to the, and I quote, immensely contagious, almost aggressive idea of continuous change, permanent progress, aggrandizement, enlargement, expansion, conquest, endless growth, and endless growth of growth, as well as the idea of a perfect world, which it is necessary to build peacefully, and if it doesn't work, by force, unquote, as ideas that are typically European. And he also spoke out against the fetishes of consensus and orthodoxy. Quote, the European history also includes the skeptics, the critics, the shy spirits who question all the realities of this world, and first of all themselves, and who are even able to brilliantly articulate their doubts. Or do not such personalities as Albert Camus, Franz Kafka, Samuel Beckett, Umberto Eco, and others embody the very tradition of European awe and European humility, which perhaps we should at this moment follow first and foremost, unquote. Now, many people claim that what we are missing these days is leadership of the kind that put Europe back on its feet after the most terrible war in its history, and that sustained it through the tense 40 years of the Cold War, and that opened the way for its unification at the end of it. Leadership is a quality often invoked today as the potential magical cure to our present malaise. But there is nothing magical about leadership. It is a quality of moral responsibility, of standing up for the values one believes in, showing the courage to make sacrifices for these values in terms of power, popular standing, and even one's own well-being, and a sense of responsibility to promise to the voters all that can be reasonably promised, rather than things that can never be realized. And it's something that is, it is sometimes a very fine distinction between political acts that are well-meant and responsible, and political acts that are well-meant and silly. And there is no better example that comes to my mind than, the Chancellor Merkel's insistence on there being no limit to the European ability to absorb mass migration. I mean, it was a very admirable thing of her to say, because it was, I believe, driven by a true, genuine human instinct. But it was also a political mistake of very large proportions, and it's now coming back to haunt her in the negotiations about the next German government, and the future looks very, very murky for both. Murky for Merkel. I mean, this was not an intended pun. So, where do we find that sense of responsibility? I mean, it's not something that you can find on the street every day. For Vaclav Havel, the question of responsibility was rooted metaphysically, as he put it, in the ultimate horizon of being. Behind and beyond the horizon of our everyday existence. It was almost a religious idea of a book, a record, so to speak, in which all our deeds are recorded, and they will be one day brought to life and judged. Havel was not a religious man, but he was certainly a spiritual man. So the idea of responsibility rooted in the ultimate horizon of being remained central to his thinking as a political activist, as a dissident, and as a statesman throughout his life. In 1967, after the Fourth Congress of the Union of Czechoslovak Writers, which was one of the events that led to the Prague Spring a year later and to the eventual invasion of the Warsaw Pact forces led by the Red Army in Czechoslovakia, he was the only one who, in the midst of emotional outcries, reminded his suddenly radical colleagues, and I will quote, "The question is simply whether we are all capable to ultimately bear the responsibility for our words, whether we are really and unreservedly able to vouch for ourselves, guarantee our proclamations by our acts and their continuity, and never be, led by the best of intentions as it may be, trapped at a certain moment by ourselves, whether because of our vanity or because of our fear. This is not a call for calculation, but for authenticity," unquote. And this call, in a nutshell, is for me the legacy of Václav Havel in Europe today. And I will thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you for your deep insights, and I hope that our audience got some questions or some thoughts to discuss. Please, the floor is yours.
What is the role of theater in the?
Gintas Mažeikis.
What is the role of theater in the vast activity of Václav Havel? Could you comment?
In the last activity?
I mean in the presidency.
It's a very interesting question. Of course, Havel was a playwright because before he was a politician, and he had he believed in theater all his life as not a mirror of life, not as a commentary on life, but he believed in theater as a totally independent and sovereign form of human activity. He early in his career he realized that theater is much more than a stage and a text and the props and people who the director and the actors, but that it is a kind of a community building device, that it brings people together and makes them think through the experience, liberates them through the experience, and makes them keen to do other things. And this is my personal experience too. I was 15 years old when I saw in Prague the fest Havel's play The Garden Party, and it was a revelation for me. I mean, it took away the cover, the front from the everyday reality as we experience it, and it showed us the full absurdity of the situation and showed it to us as a comedy. I mean, it's a very, very funny play. And I saw the play maybe 7 or 8 times in those years, and I had friends who saw it 15 or 16 times, and we knew the whole text by heart and exchanged the lines in our everyday conversation, and it created a mood that for many of us lasts, you know, I'm not afraid to say to this day. So it was Havel's opening to the experience of shared emotions and shared values and shared activities. Later on, he used it more deliberately as because his plays are very analytical, and he had a very great power of analytical thinking. So he used it as a device to uncover various aspects of totalitarian thinking, bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. And the funny thing is that his essays and his plays were complementing each other in a sort of a dialectical way. In his essays, he, like The Power of the Powerless, he describes in all seriousness, his essays are quite serious stuff, sometimes very difficult to read too. His ideas about freedom, about life, about human rights, about identity, etc., etc. In his plays, which are invariably comedies, he describes what happens if one does not act according to his values, according to his ideas. There is not a single positive character in his plays. I mean, they're all negative, they all fail, they all and they all dark comedies, the plays. So he's quite merciless to to his characters to illustrate the same points that he illustrates in the positive in his essays. Now the last part is what happens when a playwright becomes president. Well, various things happen. In about 2 months after Havel was elected president, Harold Pinter, his friend and admirer and a famous British playwright, came to Prague, and Havel took him for a dinner, and we spent several hours talking, and Havel wanted to know what's new in the British theatre, etc., etc. But it turned out that Pinter was only interested in one thing: how does a playwright become a president? And of course, in a monarchy like Britain, that's very difficult to do. Anyway, so this is one of the things that happened. The other thing that happened was that, of course, the experience of being the president provided some material for the playwright. And Havel, after he left office, and that may be what you were asking about, wrote his last play, which is called Leaving, and which is a play about a statesman who leaves the office and struggles with the phenomenon of losing power, of becoming unimportant, of having to defend his legacy, even of having to think whether this particular teacup that was presented to him by Mao Zedong, he makes fun even of that, whether it belongs to the government or whether it belongs to him personally, something that every statesman probably knows. And he also describes in the play some very rather nasty, power-seeking, aventurist, opportunist characters that many people who saw the play for the first time took one of them for Václav Klaus, Havel's successor as the president and our former prime minister, who had many disagreements with Havel, and some thought that this was Havel's way of settling the scores. But as sometimes happens, the truth was completely different, because we know, and I knew then, that Havel started to write the play, which he always called his Lear play, because it's loosely based on the King Lear story, in 1987, 3 years before he became the president. And we have in the library the first draft of the play, but then he became the president, had to interrupt the writing, finished it after leaving the presidency. So some of the details may truly have been influenced by his presidency, but the basic idea of the play, which he combined the King Lear layout or the King Lear story with the layout of the cherry orchard by Chekhov. So it's King Lear played out, acted out in the cherry orchards scene on the cherry orchard stage. Again, it's a very funny play, but it's a dark play. I mean, it's basically the upshot of the play is that once you had power, there's no way you can escape from it. Even when you give it up.
Sounds very Shakespearean. Probably the unique politician in Europe, or in Western Europe, of the Shakespearean political education. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4.
You know, there have been libraries written about issues of memory, remembrance, commemoration, but there is now also this kind of counter movement. For instance, David Reef, with his In Praise of Forgetting, that, you know, too much memory is becoming an obstacle. You need to be able to forget. Like, if the Serbians would finally forget about Kosovo Polje, things might be a little bit more easy on the Balkans. So what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I know the David Reeves thesis, and I have problems with it. I mean, of course, we cannot, if you only live by memories, and that for many people means traumas, past traumas, there's no way to live. I mean, it will bring you down and haunt you all your life. So there must be a mechanism to transcend the past, to overcome it. But I think what Reeve does not sufficiently come to terms with is that it requires some kind of a process of purification of the memory, process of and these are all religious terms, but there's also a secular language for it, process of repentance, of forgiveness, of reconciliation, but an essential part of the process is establishing the record. Yeah? And that's why the commissions of truth in South Africa, in Chile, in other countries, in my mind, did play an important role. Because unless you can agree on what happened, you cannot put the past behind. You know, there was yesterday, we have our president is on a state visit to Russia at the moment, and he's considered one of the most pro-Russian European leaders today. And yesterday in the official journal of the Russian armed forces, there was an article saying that the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 was the greatest service that Russia has ever, the Soviet Union has ever given the Czech people. You know, that's not a very good recipe for good relationship between the two countries in the future, because until and unless we can agree on what happened then, and there's no way we could agree on this, then, you know, the past is still open, and that's the problem of dealing with the past.
Please introduce yourself. Leonardo, professor of sociology. I'd like to return to your very important notion of hubris that you put into Vaclavo Havel's notion, and as it comes in different concepts and ways, as faith in this unlimited scientific and technological growth or progress, and growth of growth, as you have nicely put it, but also even in terms of fetishizing leadership in contemporary world. What texts or maybe plays of Vaclav Havel comes to your mind in dealing with this notion of hubris itself, but also of transgressing or transcending it in the contemporary world? As we all know, it's not, to put it very primitively, easy task to transgress this belief in scientific technological development, in even, as you mentioned, consensus and so on.
Well, there are quite a few texts in which Havel deals with this issue. Some of it is in his speeches. His speech to the joint session of the Congress of the United States Congress in February 1990 is one of the texts when he speaks about it. There is also the Harvard commencement speech 1995 or 1996 in which he elaborates on the idea. But for me the key to his understanding of hubris and humility is in the letters to Olga, in the book of correspondence that he wrote in jail and that started as a normal correspondence with one's wife and developed into a rather complex and profound piece of philosophical thinking. And again, it's not a book that's very easy to read, and it's even more difficult to read because we know that from Havel that he deliberately made some of the passages even more difficult to understand for the prison censors, to get past the censorship. So it's you have to translate it back into normal language a little. But he in about 3 letters in the last part of the book, 91 letters, 136 to 138, I believe, he writes about his personal crisis, and for me, and I think for him too, it was a crucial episode in his life. In 1977, after he was after the Charter 77 was published, he was first arrested, and he spent 4 months in jail. And this was his first time he was in prison, and he was perfectly miserable. He felt deprived of everything, of his wife, of his friends, of his favorite tea, of all kinds of, the little things that make up our daily life. And after 3 months of this, he made a compromise. He wrote a letter to the prosecutor in which he basically pledged to not to change his views, not to deny his views, anything like that, but to refrain from public political activities if he is released. And the prosecutor started and the investigators started a protracted negotiations about the letter with him, and he already knew he made a mistake. But there was no way to retract the letter because they already had it. And finally, he was let out of jail, and of course the authorities published the whole letter, and Havel felt completely disgraced. He felt he ruined his own life. And the funny thing was that most of his friends were very understanding of what he did. I mean, it was a very uneven contest between a prisoner and his jailers, and he did not do anything disreputable, and etc., etc., and they would forgive him, but he didn't forgive himself. And he spent the next 2 years in perfect personal anguish. And gradually he came to the realization that the only way to make up for it, at least in part, as he writes, is to go back to jail. And so he renewed his activities, pledge or no pledge, and became even more outspoken, and in the end he had his wish and he ended up in jail for 4.5 years, etc. And in the letters that were written during the second imprisonment, he describes the whole story, and he sees its roots, its beginning in the hubris of believing that he was so good, so smart, so rational that he could outwit the interrogators, and it's a beautiful essay on human fallibility and on human hubris, and everything after that, I believe, comes from this.
Mykolas Drunga, I work here at the Lithuanian Immigration Institute. But now, probably a difficult question. There are hundreds of thousands, even millions of refugees banging on Europe's door, and Angela Merkel opens it, probably without consulting her own government, which is a coalition government, so it's not just Christian Democrats, but anyway, and probably certainly without consulting other European leaders. So the question is, what would Vaclav Havel have done if he were in Merkel's shoes? Or at least, what would he have advised her?
Well, it's a question that is actually not so difficult, because I've been asked that question before, and we have given it a lot of thought. And in fact, 2 years ago, we, in one of the conferences I spoke about, the conference on the occasion of the Vaclav Havel Human Rights Prize, 2 years ago, when the migration crisis was at its height, we devoted the whole conference to that issue and to that topic. And we also researched our archives, our records, for anything that Havel might have thought or said about the subject. And we found a number of things, some of them dating back to 1985, to his book, what is it called in English? Dálkový výslech who escaped the country after the Warsaw Pact invasion in 1968, and on other occasions. And he says this is a matter of not of policy, not of politics. It's a matter of universal moral obligation. It's a part of our history, of our culture. But then he also says this is true, but it is also true that that not everyone who wants to come to Europe could fit in there. That we could be overrun by millions and millions of people who want to come to Europe, not just fleeing from war or starvation, but to make a better life, which is a perfectly understandable wish, but not necessarily entitling people to any special protection or assistance. And so he thinks about, and he writes, we might do better if we spend more energy and more time on diffusing crises and preventing crises before they happen in the countries from which the people flee. And I completely believe that if we Europeans and Americans did not screw up on Syria and intervene while the intervention was still possible, then many people who are still coming and who might still be coming would not have to leave the country. But then Havel says something that is slightly controversial, but for me it is also valid. He says, you know, and this is written in 1985 during the communist era for context. He says, after all, when I tell my own countrymen that maybe not all of us should leave here, but some of us should stay here and try to make the country livable again, why shouldn't I tell it to other people? It's their responsibility as well. And so suddenly you see Havel not only as an idealist, he was a moralist, but also as a practical thinker, as a thinker about the parameters of the crisis, about the roots of the crisis, and about the possible solutions to the crisis. So that's Havel on migration.
Your question. Your question. Oh, no.
I am Monica Reshev, daughter of Olshay Kshtiania, professor in VDU. I have a slightly different question. You said that Havel was a seeker of truth, and nowadays there is a bit of a challenge to people who are seeking truth. Because there is FCC, for example, in America, being discussed right now, which brings a paywall to the internet, sections it, make some content inaccessible. So what do you think, is there a way to resist for us in Europe if this comes to being? Thank you.
Okay, I'm not certain I'm informed enough about this. FCC means the Federal Communications Commission, or I am not aware of any regulation that would be on books valid that would limit the content of the internet, but I may be wrong. It's you may know more about it than I do. So I'm in principle, for the same reason I'm against the right to be forgotten. I am against any meddling with the freedom of the net, and I think it's a shame that some of the big global companies such as Google make in the interests of doing business, make compromises with countries like China about the censorship of the internet. But I do not know that is already happening in the United States. If it is, I will be as against it as I am against it in China, but I don't know.
But if you think about the image of Havel in other places in Czech, but Prague, do you think we are doing a good job? Because the extremist party and the rise of the popularity is very much among young people born to democracy. So are we really doing enough to promote Havel among the people that are my age or younger or around that? Mm-hmm. Or is the image of Havel actually better abroad than in Czech? Thank you.
About the number of immigrants, I mean, the estimates differ very widely between 8 and 18, which is more than 100% difference. But the truth is that there are very few immigrants well, it's not the truth. We have to be precise. The truth is that there are very few people who came as asylum seekers to the Czech Republic in the latest refugee wave. The truth also is, because sometimes the country is labeled because of this, it is labeled as a xenophobic country. The truth is that there are almost 500,000 foreigners living in the Czech Republic, which is 5% of the population, which happens to be exactly the EU average. You know, so
living legally. There is a lot of
Oh yeah, there are some other people, we don't know how many, but we also need the other people because, you know, if you want to get your plumbing fixed or a wall built in your garden, you need some of them. So it's not that we are so xenophobic, but we are Islamophobic. That's certainly the case, and it's sometimes very difficult to understand for people in Western Europe. But the truth is, historically, we had no experience with Islam whatsoever. I mean, the Ottoman Empire never came north of the Danube. It was stopped at Vienna. We never had colonies or vast overseas trade with other countries, being a landlocked country. So all these sources of experience with Islam we did not have, which does not excuse anyone for being a racist, but it does something to explain the phobia about people we don't know, because people fear most what they know least, and that is probably our case. So that was the refugees. And then you ask about something else.
About the image of Havel.
About the image of Havel. I will have to. I'm sorry for being so expansive on this, but I think you need to speak a little about the context. In the Czech political debate, we are often, people like me, the library of Vaclavo Havelo, our friends, etc., are often labeled as either the truth and lovers. Havel once said that truth and love must prevail over lies and hatred, and so they call us truth and lovers, and they don't mean it as a compliment. But every time I hear it, I think you have a problem with truth and love. Fine, but it's not my problem. But we are also called Pražská kavárna, the Prague coffee house.
Prague Cafines.
Yeah, Prague Cafines. People who all know each other and who already agree with each other and need to convince each other about what they already agree upon. And when I came to the library, I thought whether this is true or not. I mean, we have to do something to break that, and that explains why I am traveling every week all over the country to bigger towns or smaller towns, and meet with students, meet in libraries, meet in public spaces, even in kavárnas, even in the coffee houses. And my experience so far has been that it's a dirty lie, that there are people all over the country who are motivated, interested, idealistic. They may not be a majority, that's true, but there's never an idealistic majority in any country. So the image, and we know that also from the everyday talks in the library and from our internet and the Facebook footprint, which is growing bigger and bigger every day. I mean, we are the most cited NGO in the country, in the media. So, I mean, we have political problems in the country, but I feel that Havel's legacy is safe. But it is true, as you said, that his image is even better in many places outside the country than it is in the country. And I think the explanation for that is quite simple. You know, the further away you get from a place where something is happening, the fewer details you see. You see only the big picture. And of course there's this big picture of Havel as a saint, as someone on a par with Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King and Gandhi, the great liberator, and especially Americans, you know, have this way of seeing things in a rather simplified Hollywood way. And Havel, and he would be the first to admit it, was a man like any other. He had his faults. He made some bad decisions. Some people liked him, some people didn't like him. Some people hated his idea, and so in the country itself, in the Czech Republic, you find many more shades of the opinion. But at the end of the day, when he left his office in the first days of 2003, he went on the television and on the radio to give a farewell address to the people of the country, and he said, look, I mean, I did what I did because I was convinced that this was right, and I did it to the best of my ability and everything. And to the people who did not like what I did or what I said, or even to the people who hated my guts, I ask for their forgiveness. And you know, it's not a farewell speech you get from almost any politician. So yes, he was not a perfect man, and I always defend his imperfections. You know, because I hate, and we had it during the communist days. You know, if people had the saints they were showing to us, if they had some problems in their families or with their friends, so they simply retouched the friend out of the photograph and you know, never said a word about the family, etc. So that's nonsense. You know, he was a man like we are.
Thank you.